As I've said in previous videos, the subversion of a group's identity should be seen as an act of aggression and a crime against humanity. I believe the same is true of the subversion of a group's indigeneity. That said, of all the troubling aspects of this multifaceted offensive against those of European descent, perhaps the most troubling is the attempted subversion of the indigeneity of European ethnic groups. It is imperative that we secure an existence for our people and a future for our children. That can only be done through ethnic nationalism, and perhaps the most crucial requirement for a morally legitimate return to ethnic nationalism in Europe is to ensure that our indigeneity is not subverted by our treacherous enemies. Attempts to subvert the indigeneity of Europeans can be comprehensively refuted by simply examining the ethnohistory of non-European ethnic groups considered indigenous in various regions in the world. By identifying similar ethnohistories between non-European and European groups, we can compare and contrast each group's general acceptance as the indigenous peoples of their respective homelands. Then any double standards applied to Europeans will be clearly transparent as discriminatory and ethnocidal. Patriotic Alternative in the United Kingdom understands the moral authority of indigeneity and its foundational significance in the argument in favor of ethnic nationalism. And so for this exercise I will use the indigenous peoples of the British Isles as an example. In terms of ethnohistory, there are several ethnic groups indigenous to island archipelagos throughout the world that have marked similarities to the indigenous ethnic groups of the British Isles. Many times you will hear our enemies argue that the modern English are Germanic invaders in an attempt to rationalize the current invasion of the British Isles by non-indigenous groups. However, the vast majority of indigenous British ethnic groups have a genetic profile that is majority Celtic. The Celts of Britain and Ireland descend from Yamnaya-related Bell-Beaker folk who invaded Britain and Ireland and replaced and/or mixed with a Neolithic culture from the Aegean around 4,500 to 5,000 years ago. The vast majority of indigenous British Islanders also carry various amounts of genetic admixture from Germanic peoples who invaded and/or settled Britain in various waves between 950 and 1600 years ago. The amount of Germanic admixture varies in different parts of the Isles, but are strongest in eastern England, where an average of 25 to 40% of modern Englanders' ancestry is attributable to continental Germanic origins. Perhaps the most valid comparison to the ethnohistory of the British archipelago is the Japanese archipelago. The Japanese archipelago is similar to the British archipelago in that it is situated off the coast of a major landmass. The Yamato people are the dominant modern ethnic group of Japan and constitute the majority of the population there, but the Yamato, similar to the indigenous ethnic groups of the British Isles, are the result of the mixing of two ancient groups. Between 1700 to 2300 years ago, a mainland race, the Yayoi, began invading Japan and either replacing or mixing with the Jomon people who inhabited Japan before the Yayoi began arriving. The modern genetic profile of the Yamato people is about 90% Yayoi and only 10% Jomon, so the Yamato are on average almost entirely descended from a mainland race that has only been in Japan for 2300 to 1700 years. Some Japanese minority ethnic groups, like the Ainu, received significantly less genetic admixture from the invading Yayoi, similar to how some Celtic groups in the British Isles, like Highland Scots, received less Germanic admixture than groups like the Eastern English. The Ainu are speculated to be of Caucasian origin, largely due to their morphology and phenotype, but genetic evidence has not corroborated this theory as well as expected. And so our enemies say that the English are Germanic invaders, even though at the highest prevalence of Germanic admixture in the British Isles, the genetic contribution is about 25 to 40% Germanic. In contrast, the Yamato are 90% Yayoi, a continental group who began arriving in Japan only a few hundred years before the Angles, Saxons, Jutes, and Frisians began arriving in England. And yet the indigeneity of the Yamato is rarely, if ever, challenged by the cultural Marxist establishment. Perhaps the next most apt comparison is the Malagasy people from Madagascar. Much like the indigenous peoples of the British Isles, there are several distinct Malagasy sub-ethnic groups. The Malagasy descend from Austronesian peoples who used outrigger canoes to reach Madagascar from the Sunda Islands of the Malay archipelago around 1500 to 1950 years ago. When the Austronesians arrived, they probably replaced a hunter-gatherer group that was already living there, but there is not a lot of solid evidence to confirm this. Bantu African peoples arrived later, around 1300 years ago, and intermixed with the Austronesians. Therefore, all Malagasy people have some proportion of Bantu and Austronesian DNA. Different Malagasy sub-ethnic groups vary in the proportion of Bantu and Austronesian DNA they have, just as various British ethnic groups vary in how much Celtic and Germanic DNA they have. However, the later influx of Bantu African DNA is generally the most dominant among the Malagasy, especially among the coastal sub-ethnic groups. So the Malagasy as a whole, much like the Yamato of Japan, are actually more closely related to a race that invaded later and intermixed with the original inhabitants. The Malagasy are more Bantu than the English are Germanic, and yet nobody is trying to subvert the indigeneity of the Malagasy by saying that they are descended from Bantu invaders. Another method of exposing subversion of European indigeneity is to examine non-European ethnic groups, which are largely considered indigenous to their respective geographic region, and compare the amount of time they've been inhabiting that region, in contrast to how long indigenous European ethnic groups have inhabited their respective regions in Europe. For example, the people considered the indigenous ethnic group of the Greater and Lesser Antilles in the Caribbean are collectively called the Taino peoples. The Taino came to the Antilles from the South American landmass starting around 550 BCE, thereafter spreading throughout the Caribbean and reaching the Bahamas about 1,000 years later. Contrast that with the Proto-Celtic Bell-Beaker people, from which contemporary British ethnic groups descend. The Bell-Beaker began arriving in the British Isles from continental Europe about 3000 BCE, almost 2,500 years before the Taino people arrived in the Greater Antilles from the South American landmass. Likewise, the people considered the indigenous ethnic group of New Zealand are the Maori people. The Maori came to the New Zealand archipelago around 1300 Common Era, which is about 4,300 years after the Bell-Beaker folk began arriving in the British Isles. That is also 900 years after Germanic tribes began arriving in Britain, and is only 200 years after the Norman conquest. The British are criticized as genocidal colonizers and oppressors for conquering the Maori, but now it is expected of Europeans to stand idly by while we are replaced in our own homelands. Any person who tries to undermine the indigeneity of contemporary European ethnic groups is an evil and genocidal coward. Therefore, they deserve to be completely humiliated and vilified. The fight for indigeneity is very real and crucial for the success of any future ethno-nationalist movement. Arguments like the ones made in this video must be mainstreamed and brought to the forefront of the battle between our enemies and those defending exclusive European ethnic identity and indigeneity.